Hello everyone and welcome to this mini workshop that we're going to do today called Eco Embellishments. So the idea is I'm going to show you ways to use up bits and pieces of things that you consider rubbish, maybe that you've got lying around the house, particularly with it coming up to Christmas. Lots of sweet wrappers, shiny bits of paper, envelopes, things like that. I'm going to show you how we can manipulate them, chop them out into different shapes, and then using simple needle and thread or glue if you've got little ones who are joining in, to actually attach these to bits of fabric or paper to make some really interesting tactile and colourful samples. So here's a little sample of mine that I've used a Twix wrapper, so just a chocolate bar wrapper or anything. Obviously it's got the nice gold metallic. I've just folded up and scrunched and stitched down on fabric. This one, again, just little oddments and bits and pieces that I've got lying around. I've got some magazine pages here, some fabric scraps, some little negative spaces where I've cut out these little circles, painted papers, some elastic bands. They make quite nice shapes on fabric. Some sort of circles folded in half, some little loom bands or elastic bands, teeny tiny ones stitched on top to make this lovely pattern. So those are sort of some of my samples. Again, you know, the idea with this workshop is that you can choose the materials, you can choose the shapes, and really just sort of go wild and do whatever design that you prefer. So I'm going to run through some of the basic materials that you will need to have a go with this project. Again, a lot of it you can sort of switch out and use different bits and pieces depending on what you've got available to you or what you've got in the house, but there is no need to go out and buy a load of specialist equipment. A lot of the things you will have lying around. So most importantly, you need a base fabric. Or paper or thin card, so basically something that we can put a needle and thread through. Now you can see here I've got an embroidery hoop. You do not have to use an embroidery hoop if you don't have one. I use it because what it does is it causes the fabric to have a tension, so when you're stitching through it means it stays nice and flat. But say if you were stitching through a piece of cardboard or something that has a bit of stiffness already, you don't need a hoop. Again, it's only if you have one available to you. Needle and thread, so you can see here I have a selection of needles. Can be a big eye, small eye, again whatever you have. Most people I know have a sewn needle somewhere in the house. If you are doing this with small children and they want to have a go and they don't want to do sewing, you know, if they're small, then again use a bit of glue or even some double-sided tape. Perfect, because we're going to use recycled bits, paper, mixed media materials, plastics. You know, glue or a bit double-sided tape will do the trick as well. In terms of sewing thread, so again, whatever you have around, whatever your preference is. I've got a few different colours here. I like to use these ones that are in a little sort of spool in a ball like this. These are called perlé cottons. Just means it's sort of a bit of a shiny thread, and that is the thickness. So I like to use this sort of thickness. You can see it across the palm of my hand, so that when I put it onto the fabric I've got a nice colourful line that I can see, but at the same time it's not so thin that if I'm pulling it through it's going to snap. You can use sort of stranded cottons, the ones that are thicker, and you can sort of pull them apart. You can use ribbons, you can use embroidery, sort of machine embroidery thread. Again, whatever you have available to you. Now, another thing that's important is a good sharp pair of scissors. It's a good idea to maybe have one or two, particularly if you're cutting through plastic, so don't use sort of really good scissors that you might risk going a bit blunt. And then the most important bit, the bit where you can really be creative, is your selection of materials. So I'm going to show a variety of mine here. So particularly with it being the sort of festive season at the moment, I think there's even more sort of plastics and things that are sort of you might pick up. And again, if you don't like throwing things out like I do, this is a brilliant way to sort of reuse your waste and turn it into something creative and fun. So just a selection. So I keep lots of scraps. So this is a scrap of wallpaper, some cardboard packaging that I've got. I've obviously had some sort of product in it, but I quite like the shiny foil. some music paper here. There was a gift bag. So again, a lot of these are paper and card, but because they've got the metallic on, it means that they're really hard to recycle. And you know, that metallic is going to add a little bit of sparkle to our little sampler that we're doing. So food packaging, really big one this time of year. So only thing to watch with food packaging is obviously make sure that whatever you use is clean. A lot of these sort of outside packages, particularly things like sweets, biscuits, soft chocolates, are all quite bright and vibrant, and this plastic again cannot be recycled. So you know, this orange colour is perfect. More sweet wrappers. Again, these are nice and shiny, and what you'll see inside is they're sort of silver or metallic inside, so you've got a double-sided thing to use. So I've got lots of those. What I do with my sweet wrappers is, you can see I just cut it out so it's a flat sheet, and then I sort of bundle them together in a little clip so you've got everything all together. So I've got a few of these. Obviously any scraps of fabric that you've got lying around are good. Got some little swatches here that I've got for another project. So again, these are perfect for either chopping up, stitching on as is. Little scrap of tartan, another sweet wrapper. Got some of the crinkly paper that you actually have inside sort of posh biscuits or sweets and things. This is nice because it's got a bit of a texture, you can feel it. This would be perfect. You could paint or add colour to it first before cutting bits out. Metallic lids off dessert pots. Tins off mince pies, they're really good to use. Got some silver sticky back plastic scraps. A few more scraps. Envelopes are brilliant. So I've got this little envelope here that I can cut out. Lots and lots of fabric scraps. So again, these are something that I save year round. So I have a little box, any sort of odds and ends that I've chopped off another project, snip it off, put it in a little box, and then when you want to do project, you've got a good selection of bits and pieces to choose from. So some of them are more Christmassy themed. I've got this little scrap of red felt with the little silver stars on, but it doesn't have to be particularly Christmassy. It can be anything you've got. Again, some packaging that I've had that's come. This is quite interesting because it's a little bit transparent. Can make interesting things with that. Brown cardboard. Obviously I know this one can be recycled, but it's just a different texture and something to have a go with. And finally, last little example, this sort of biscuit container, which again we can chop out these bits, quite interesting with the little squares in. So those are bits and pieces that you need to get started. You know, you don't have to have the huge variety of things that I've just shown you. This is just sort of some examples to give you a bit of inspiration for making your own collection. You can start off with as simple as 1 or 2 things and build up, maybe when you've got more ideas or want to do more projects. So obviously to get started, I put my fabric in the hoop like this. If you're working off the hoop, you know, just hold your fabric in your hand. I tend to go for a size roughly like this, which is maybe about sort of 10 to 12 centimetres square. If you're doing a little piece of paper, you know, cut a square. Square's nice and easy to work with because, you know, we can lay our shapes out really nicely and it's easy for us to get an idea of what to do as well. Okay, so to begin our sort of eco embellishment workshop, so I've cut a piece of this tray out and we're just going to cut basic shapes. I'm going to go for a square to begin with, out of whichever material that you choose. So if you've got small children and you're doing this, obviously just be careful if you cut in anything that's particularly stiff. Just watch them with the scissors. So I've chopped this out. I'm just going to trim that little bit off the edge like that. Now most materials, things like plastics, are actually really easy to poke a sewing needle through. If you're struggling, a good tip that I have is either get an old cork or some blue tack, and then before you actually put it on your piece, just get your needle and poke it through into the cork or the blue tack behind, so then you've got your hole ready to stitch. So I'm cutting that off so you can see that already makes a lovely, quite a nice shape. So I want to decide where I want to put it on my fabric, or if you're using paper, on your paper. And we're just going to stitch flat shapes on it. It's almost like collage, but we're using our needle and thread to sort of attach the things to the background. So I'm just holding it with one hand. I've got a nice double knot on the end of my thread. That's really important to make sure you don't pull it all the way through. If you're working on paper rather than fabric, you might find that you might need an even bigger knot because obviously the paper makes a bigger hole, whereas this, the weave closes back up and means that it will secure it. So I'm going to come through the middle of my shape. So pull my thread through, and then all we're going to do is just go from the top of the thread back through. So I'm going to follow this line across. You can choose wherever you want to put the stitch and however big you want to put the stitch. Watch on the edge of your shapes. And there you go. So that is all it needs to secure it. You don't need to go all the way around the edge. I'm going to do a couple more to add some pattern. Obviously you can lay different shapes up as well. So this is just sort of a basic sequin idea. Now people think that a sequin has to be circle. It doesn't. A sequin can be made out of any material and can be any shape that you want. You know, I think if it's stitched onto fabric, it's a sequin. So doing a few more stitches. So this is just a simple straight stitch or running stitch. So if I turn it over to the back, you can see my fabric looks like this. So don't worry about what it looks like on this side. Concentrate on your front. So there's my first little embellishment or sequin. Now I'm going to cut something else and put another one on. So I'm going to go for sort of a mixed media effect. So I'm going to do a little bit of this pink paper envelope. So I'm going to cut another square the same. Again, I'm just, you know, doing it by eye. You don't have to be really accurate unless you particularly want to be. So I'm going to go through the centre again on this one. So I'm just gently poking my needle through the middle, pulling it down onto the fabric like that. And then this piece, I'm actually going to do another layer. So before I actually go back through the fabric, I'm going to attach on another layer. So two are going to sit on together. Now I've sort of pre-cut some little shapes here. You can see I've got a little two-layered square with a square cut out the middle. This is a little piece of cardboard packaging. So this one I'm going to, it's a bit stiffer, so therefore I'm going to be a bit more careful with my needle, give it a good wiggle to go through, and that's going to sit like that. And then we might even finish with a final one. Now, one of my tips to cut some of your own sequins, if you want to cut some circles, is to use just your standard hole punch. You don't have to do this, but again, a lot of people have them sort of lying around at home, and they're a really good bit of kit, particularly if you're using sort of papers, cardboards, or in my case, a mince pie tin. So I'm just going to cut a little circle out with my hole punch. You can see there it's cut that little hole out. They're quite small, so they are a bit fiddly. Flatten that out like that. That's my little circle, and then again I'm just going to go through the middle really carefully with my needle, and I'm going to put that on my fabric. And then this time all I'm doing is going back down through the two layers underneath with my needle and thread. And there we go, there's the second embellishment. So you can layer as many different shapes up as you like to make these little layered pieces like this, which look really lovely. I'm going to do one more. And obviously another thing with these little tiny hole punch ones is they almost look like snow, so if you're doing something that's more of a Christmas theme, that's a really nice thing to do. So let's cut another one with the hole punch. And what another thing I like with the hole punch is you can have these lovely negative pieces, which again you can cut out and attach onto your fabric on their own. So I've got a couple more. I'm going to stitch them on next to this piece. So again, holding my little tiny sequin that I've just cut out of my mince pie tin, coming up through, sitting it on the fabric, and then I'm just going to go back through the mince pie tin and the fabric together just to make a tiny little stitch like that. again, do the next one. And you know, you can choose the composition and the layout for this. I'm going really abstract just to get some colour and shape down, but you could do a Christmas scene if you wanted. You could draw out a design first and plan it out, or you can do what I'm doing and just sort of go with the flow and see where it takes you with your materials and things all together. Another important step is when you've done a little piece like this and you want to either change thread colour or maybe move to a different area of your fabric or your paper, we need to tie off the back to make sure that this is nice and secure and not going to come loose. So we just flip over to the back, grab my thread. Now you want to make sure that you've got a decent amount of thread. At the moment I've got quite a lot left on, but as a rule of thumb you don't want to be leaving the thread tail any shorter than sort of this, which is about 7 or 8 centimeters, because you will then struggle to tie it tightly. So I normally keep my needle on. Okay, so I'm just doing a simple knot, but what is important is my thumb and this finger are sitting on the fabric and they're going to push the knot down so that it's nice and tight. So I've done one, I'll do another one. So again, just looping it around like a normal knot, using this thumb and finger to push the knot down, and I'm pulling it really tightly. So I'll do that 2 or 3 times, and that just means that your knot is really close to the fabric. You just about see it there. If you find you've done your knot and it's sort of further up, not to worry at all. Good tip that I have is that you can always get a little bit of glue, fabric glue, put it on your knot and just sort of blob it down on the back, which will make sure that it stays nice and taut and you don't lose any of that lovely detail that you've just worked to put on the front. So we've had a quick look at flat shapes and ideas. I'm going to also show you some ways that we can add 3D and more textured elements onto our piece with our recycled materials to really add a bit of depth and sort of more touchy-feely appeal, I suppose, to the front of our little sample. So what we're going to have a look at next is ways to make 3-dimensional embellishments. So things that, rather than sitting flat on the surface like this, we want them to stand up more off the surface itself, to give sort of a different look, a bit more sort of like a pop-up type shape or something with a bit more texture. So what's one really important thing when you're thinking about making things 3-dimensional is the actual material you're working with. So if you're doing things with sort of recycled plastics, thin metals, cardboard, paper, one thing that they all have in common is that you can fold them and they will keep the fold. So you know, if you do a shape, crease it, that is going to stay. So that gives our material a bit of structure. If you're using sort of fabric scraps and softer things, they don't have that sort of structure that makes them stand up as much. So we're going to use that to our advantage with creating some different shapes. So what we're going to start with first is we're going to cut a thin strip of some sort of flexible sort of plastic packaging. It's going to work really well. So maybe about 2 to 3 centimeters. Again, you can do it thick or thin. I'm going to cut mine about there. Slide my scissors along. Okay, so I've got a sort of shape like this. Now I like this because it's 2-sided, so I've got the 2 different sides, which is what I want. I'm going to cut a strip. So I've got a strip maybe about 5-7 centimeters, and we're going to make a little roll that's going to sit on the fabric like this, so almost like a little circle. Because of the flexibility of the plastic, it makes this nice shape. So start with one end. Got my needle and thread. I'm just going to poke my needle through that end like that. Little stitch back through just to secure it in place. So pull that all the way through, and then I'm going to get my other end and I'm just going to fold that over so that it sits on top. So if I move it to the side, you can see it's sort of going to be 3D stuck up from the fabric like that, and then very carefully I come up inside that loop with my thread, going through 2 layers and putting it back down, and there is my little 3D loop. So again, depending on the material that you use, this might look different. So that's with some sort of flexible plastic. Let's do another one but use something else. So let's have a look. Maybe I should use, we'll use a bit of this, the harder plastic packaging that we used here. So same thing, I'm going to cut a strip. Now this is stiffer, but again it should give the same effect. So poke my needle through one end. Because this is a bit stiffer, I sometimes have to poke one particular side. Lay it on my fabric, put my needle back through. Okay, then we flip the end over like that. And then let's come up in that layer. Now, because this is stiffer, what I'm doing is I'm going to go through like this. When I pull, that's going to sit it in the position that it needs to be. So a bit more fiddly. And then holding it with my hand like that, I'm going to put my needle and thread all the way back through to the other side. So again, three-dimensional can be a bit more fiddly than doing flat, but it does create some really interesting results. So you can see that one is a smoother curve, that one is a bit more sort of angular, but it still gets the same interesting effect. So make sure you pull that nice and tight. And then what I like to do with my 3D shapes is what's called a little float stitch, which is literally just a tiny little straight stitch just next to our embellishment that we just stitched on, and all that does is ensure that that stays nice and tight so its shape doesn't pop out. So we can do similar sort of effect with, say, a piece of ribbon or thread or something thinner. So things like gift ribbon that you get on parcels are a great one. I just got this scrap of velvet ribbon and I'm going to do the same. I'm just going to do little loops and rolls just to secure it on. So let's start on the end. So I'm just sort of twisting it and then I'm going to stitch it down. So I've sort of twisted that to the other side. And let's do another little twist like that. And another little twist. So this creates a lovely texture, and it's just, you know, twisting and looping the sort of ribbon or thin strip of plastic or paper or whatever you're using to manipulate it into sort of this 3D shape. That's the last one. So there you can see that. That's nice and 3D, lots of loops standing up from the edge. So I'm going to turn around and tie this off. So again, make sure my knot nice and tight to the back of my fabric. Pull it, snip it off. And then, you know, you can use your fingers just to sort of pull your loops into position to get that sort of nice effect. So that's one way. So that's obviously a more loopy sort of three-dimensional idea. Another one that's important is, I was saying about folding. So, you know, the way that you fold things can give them a bit of structure and again make them stand up from the surface. So metal, so this is my mince pie tin again, really good for sort of folding. So you can sort of cut whatever shapes that you want. So I've got a little square here, but let's cut something else. So let's cut something that's maybe more like petally shape. So I'm just sort of roughly doing sort of very rough petal. So there's my petal. You can see I've kept them two little negative pieces. And all I'm going to do is just pinch it at the bottom like that. So really simply, because it's metal, it's going to retain its shape, but I can sort of stitch that on the fabric like that. So it's going to sit up and be 3D. So made sure my thread has a knot in again. Come out where I want on my fabric. I'm going to, this time I want to put a hole, maybe about just from the bottom. So go through there. because I've folded it, I put my needle through into the fold to make it easier, but I want to thread it through from the opposite way. So I just turn it round and go back through like that. Sit it down on the fabric, and then we want to put our needle and thread back through the fabric just next to where we came out. So give it a pull, and then your little sequin will stand up really nicely like that. So we can obviously lay them up. You can sort of pinch them with your finger to sort of squash them into position. And again, the tension with the thread is really important here. If your thread is loose, your embellishment will sort of fall down. So let's see what else I've got. Some little cut squares. So again, I'm just pinching them at the bottom to make that little crease. Poking my needle through just near the bottom. And again, you know, you could think of other ways to fold and manipulate fabric. Think about the words such as like scrunching, sort of pleating fabrics, materials, plastics. And then we're going to go back like that. Give it a good tug to make it stand up, so you know you can layer things. So with these ones, like with this, I'm going to put a little float stitch. Obviously, if you can add beads and things like that, they will be really good, sort of standing up. You can see this one, because it's floppier, it's sort of a little bit softer. So in that case, you can always go back and put a couple more stitches in if needs be. I'm going to turn around and tie that one off again. Okay, so when I sort of got about roughly this much, that's when it's sort of time to get a new bit of thread. So trim off my end. The scrap thread you can keep and use for something else. I'll move it to the side and then turn over. And there's our little sample so far. So the idea with this is that you really do sort of build and do as many sort of details and bits and pieces as you want to create your sort of finished piece. Next, what I'm going to do is give you some ideas for things that you might want to think about doing with your finished piece, maybe ideas for taking it forward if you've enjoyed doing the workshop, and just some sort of last tips and tricks of mine that I've got for sort of making the most of your materials and your embellishments. So we'll have a look at that next. So in the Eco Embellishments workshop that we sort of looked at today and sort of what we've done, we've talked about materials and sort of really good things to save at this time of year. So rather than throwing things in the bin that can't be recycled, we can repurpose them, chop them up, manipulate them and make them into beautiful embellishments they can use. Obviously my tip, so what I do is I cut all my bits and pieces out, bundle them up with these big bulldog clips like this. Here's another one, and then I can sort of hang them up on the wall, and I've got sort of selections and bits and pieces that I can just snip off if I want little ideas for doing a new piece of work, or in sort of little jam jars or boxes or something that you've got things to use for projects. So if you've done your sample on piece of paper or card, you can actually turn that into a Christmas card or a collage that you can frame up on your wall really easily. You can always glue a piece of paper or card onto the back to cover up any of the stitching. If you've done your piece on a piece of fabric like I have, again you could even glue that onto the front of a card. If you've done it, you could have it as a sampler piece. Embroidery is really good for sort of de-stressing and just sort of playing with the shapes and the materials. Can be a way just to have some fun and try something new. So another idea that I like to do, if you do have an embroidery hoop, you can actually use your embroidery hoop as a little frame like I have with that one. So what I've done is I have stitched my design on, put my embellishments on, and then I have trimmed around the edge, got a hot glue gun, and I've just used a hot glue gun to go all around that rim so that that's ready. You can go a step further and actually paint the hoops like I have here. This one I've got a ribbon tie on, and I can actually put that on my Christmas trees, a little decoration on my wall. That one I've got a piece of felt on the back to hide all the stitching, but again you don't have to. Or, you know, if you don't want to do anything with it, it could literally just be a sampler. So I have a lot of these little samplers just like this. They're nice just for inspiration, maybe for a different idea. You could sort of cut an area out and turn it into a brooch or a badge or anything like that as well for putting onto fabric. So to finish this one off, so everything's all tied off at the back like that, and then I would just take it out the hoop. So undo this screw at the top. Oops. Move that out the way, and then there'll be my piece. So if I was thinking about sort of making that into a brooch or a badge or something, I might want to turn over the edges like that, and then there is my little sample. You can add as much or as little as you want. You can keep layering up. You might think about more materials, other shapes, something if I'm doing more Christmassy themed. You can see here I've cut out some little triangles which can look like little Christmas trees. So if you put something like that on, here's a bigger one, again just out of the waste. So again, you can make sort of a little scene, collage them on, maybe put some more little bits on. So you really can keep going and going and going and doing sort of as much as you want. I hope everyone's enjoyed having a go doing the workshop. I'd love to see the results if anyone has done, and you know, especially what the materials you've used, maybe the colours, maybe the design that you've decided to go for. So yeah, send the photographs over. My social media details should be linked to this. I'm Jessica Rose Stitch on Instagram, or Jessica Grady embroidery artist if you're on Facebook. So you can have a look on there. Love to see your creations, and thank you all for joining in. If you have any questions at all, if you want to ask me anything about the workshop or about materials, again, feel free to send me a message on socials. I'll be happy to help. Lovely to hear from you. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.